Everyone, let's welcome James Wyatt and Max McCall to Dragon Talk. Yay!
Yay! Woohoo!
Very excited to have you here again, James. It's been a long time since we chatted with you about fun stuff.
Yeah.
Max, we're excited to meet you for the first time on Dragon Talk. So let's start with you. What is your personal history with Magic the Gathering, but then also around this awesome set that's coming out, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, July 22nd?
Yeah, so I am on Magic's product strategy team, where I've been working for the last year or so. So I was the set architect for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, kind of weaving together all the disparate work that all of our teams did to bring Adventures to the Forgotten Realms to fruition. Before that, I've been playing Magic and Dungeons and Dragons all my life. So this was a very exciting opportunity to bring both of those together into one set.
Man, your enthusiasm is palpable.
I can feel the enthusiasm. I think that you, Max, actually represent a lot of people in the community that have been playing D&D and Magic maybe nearly all their lives or a big chunk of their lives. And I think this is a long time coming. I mean, we've dabbled in bringing D&D into bringing Magic into D&D with our source books and all, but we haven't explored D&D in an actual Magic set. And I can only imagine that without the help of James Wyatt, who is here in this interview, so he must have had something to do with it, it would be a beast of a project. But James, what did you have to do with this?
So I was the creative lead for the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms set, which for a normal Magic set means sort of kicking off the world building process. A lot of that work was done for us, although we did do a Magic scale world guide for the Forgotten Realms, highlighting places and races and classes. The actual job of making the cards creatively was pretty easy because the whole set design team was deeply invested in D&D and had a lot of clear ideas about the parts of D&D that they wanted to shine through in the cards. So I got those designs and said, yep, that's good, and wrote an art description of the thing that they wanted it to be in many cases, and worked with a team to put names and flavor text on all the cards and made it a thing.
You, in that answer, have touched on like 3 questions that I have. I actually have so many questions about this that I've written them down, which I very seldom do. But you, okay, first question, like we have talked a little bit here on Dragon Talk to like our game designers and all about the design and development timelines. And I think people are often surprised by how long it takes to write a book and publish a book. But I think they would be even more surprised to know how long it takes to make a full set of Magic. Or maybe not. But what are those timelines? Like, are you guys racking your brain right now trying to remember anything that you did on this set because it was so long ago?
Yes.
Maybe Max, you can probably speak to that.
Yeah, I was actually on the card design team for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. And between the pandemic and everything else, I don't remember how long ago that was. But maybe some context might help. Right now, one of the sets I'm working on, Marathon, will release in late 2023. So we're working very far in advance of the release dates of everything.
I'm actually opening up my other computer to look at file dates and see how long ago this was. I mean, I was doing creative text for this set last October when I had just moved back from the Magic team to the D&D team.
Nice.
Doing art concepting in like June of last year. But I have
in order to even get to that phase.
Yeah, I have a file of design ideas from July 2019. So 2 years.
2 years. Okay. Well, I guess that doesn't seem like that long, considering like how many cards are in a set and how much how long is the play testing period for an average set?
Many months, broken out
Yeah.
into many phases. For Magic sets, there's a couple of different stages of development. There's the exploratory design phase, which for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is basically, okay, we're going to make a D&D set. What does that mean? What do we definitely want to include? What do we definitely not want to include, and so on. And then the vision design team sort of takes what the exploratory team came up with and says, okay, we know what we're going to do and not do. Let's explore some options for those that might work. And then they identify the stuff that they think is going to be the most fun and sort of let us make the most robust and immersive set possible. And then they hand it off to the set design team, which is the team that actually starts making the cards that'll be in the final product, creating the draft formats, making sure the cards are fun to play with in all of the constructed formats. And the set design team meets, I think, for 8 months in 2 periods, like one of 5 months and one of 3 months. And then in addition to that, there's some time for our whole play design team, which is an entirely separate team, to play with the set for several months to make sure that it is fun.
Oh, it's a lot.
That is a lot. That is a lot. James, you mentioned previously that it was like trying to figure out what elements are going to go into the set. And you kind of almost made it sound like it was easy because everybody was fully invested in D&D and Magic and all. But was that truly easy? I was looking at Mac's face when you were saying that, and he was nodding. So, but I can't wrap my brain around how you can take one game and port it into a very different game, and yet you still have and I'm saying this because I've seen what I've seen, and you've managed to do it. But how did you manage to keep the essence of Dungeons and Dragons, but while playing Magic?
So
how do you do
there's a couple of things. First of all, it wasn't really easy because, like, I was joking with Jules Robbins, who was the lead set designer on it, about how many whiteboards we filled up with lists of the essential elements of D&D that we want to make sure we capture in the set, and it's more than there are cards in the set.
And more than
so there's kind of two aspects to it. One is the IP of D&D, the world of the Forgotten Realms that is the setting for this card set. And one way to think about it would be, we did Battle for Zendikar in 2015, 2014. That is a Magic set in the world of Zendikar, and the card set tries to convey the nature of this world. So at one level, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is trying to convey the world of the Forgotten Realms, just as we would a Magic world. But there is another level to it, which is the experience of playing D&D, which is slightly different than the experience of exploring the Forgotten Realms. And so for that reason, there's things in the set that have you roll a 20-sided die. There's things like innkeepers, where that would be a background part of any world, but because the tavern experience is so fundamental to many people's experience of sitting down at the table and playing D&D, that's something that's reflected in the card set. So trying to hit both of those notes, both here's this awesome fantasy world and here's this crazy game that you've played that you resonate with at a different level, was a fun balancing act.
Yeah.
What were some of those whiteboard things that were like, here's the tenets of things that we want to get in D&D?
Did you take pictures?
I probably took pictures.
What about you, Max? Do you remember any of those top level things that were like, gosh, we got to make sure we include this because they won't feel complete without it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, you've got to, the classic tavern bounties, go out of town and clear out this dangerous monster. There's got to be dragons. There's got to be dungeons. There's got to be ancient wizards in forgotten towers. There's got to be treasure. D&D's history is so rich that, like, basically anything in any of the core rulebooks is is not only fair game, but it's something where it's like, oh, people expect there to be a wizard and a sorcerer, and they expect to have a bag of many things, and they expect to see every monster in the monster manual. And the monster manual is like 300 pages or something, and there's only 260 cards in the set. So the real trouble is we've got these whiteboards full of everything. What do we pick? What's the most exciting? What's the best transposition from D&D to Magic?
Now I really want to see the magic item, a bag of many things. I think that's the bag of holding and the deck of many things combined. And now I'm like, oh my God, that's going to be amazing.
It's genius.
One of the things that experience really highlights is how everybody's experience of D&D is different. Like things that some people on the team felt were essential and iconic. I'm like, yeah, that's really a new thing that we just added in, like Volo's Guide to Monsters, not really central to the D&D experience, but for people who've started playing more recently than I did, that's like, yeah, that's a huge part of their experience with D&D.
Well, that's interesting, trying to make sure that you are serving audiences that might have known Dungeons and Dragons and Magic for, all these years, but then also there's a larger audience of D&D players, as we know, that just have come in through 5th edition and really understood the ins and the outs of it. So yeah, that's going to have different, especially with the people on the team, different things for people who've been playing for decades, perhaps. But I liked all the nods that I've seen so far with the preview cards to older lore. Mm-hmm. I think those have been really well done and translating, things like Tiamat and all these iconic characters from the Forgotten Realms to a Magic thing. So I'd love to learn a little bit. Maybe this is one of your questions, Shelley. But how do you distill something like that, like a 5-headed dragon queen, into mechanics that would make sense in a Magic duel?
That is one of my questions. Yes,
Who wants to take that one?
I will jump on that grenade.
Yeah.
To some extent, like you just did it, right? A 5-headed dragon queen. Okay, we've got a 5-color dragon who summons other dragons into play. That's what her card does, because that is a distillation into Magic mechanics of the core essence of her identity that you just threw out in those 5 words.
Yes, I saw that preview card and I said, I'm sure they play tested this, but that seems really powerful. But it's been a while since I've played Magic, so maybe summoning 5 dragons into your deck's not that big of a deal, but it seemed like it's a very powerful card.
Yeah, no, it's a big deal.
Yeah, the Tiamat is a big deal. So I was very glad to see her showing up. And then I had another question about the basic lands, because they have also been flavored with locations within the Forgotten Realms. Is that true, or can you explain how the land cards have been D&D-ified?
So
go on.
There's two answers to that question, sort of. One is that as part of the World Guide creation process, we did work with artists to get sort of an established look for certain locations within the realms. So those are reflected in the art on the land cards. But then we did something we've never done in a Magic set before and put flavor text on the land cards, which are basically adventure hooks. And we explored a number of different iterations of what that might look like. But theoretically, if you were a DM, you could take a little pack of 20 land cards and have a random adventure generator in your hands where you say, okay, here's your hook for what you're doing next. There's a weird energy coming out of the Underdark. So let's see, we did, there's 20 land cards in the set. We did one of each land type that is set in the Underdark. We did one of each land type that is sort of a settlement of some kind, and then one that's just really wilderness, and one that's ruins, I think, something like that. So reflecting the spectrum of what you'll find in the Forgotten Realms. But it's amazing how much.
I really like those.
Go ahead.
It's amazing. Oh, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's amazing how much.
All the
Go for it, Max. You got this.
Exactly the wrong amount of latency. It's perfect. Okay, he's drinking water. I was going to say, I really love all the vignettes that all of the basic lands tell. Like, whenever you're playing a game, like your lands are just telling you a different story every time, which I really enjoy, especially while my opponent is thinking, and I think they do. So there, there's kind of a lot of stuff in the set that's like that, where there's a lot going on, where we included a love letter to D&D and did stuff that we think is cool. Like, we're not going, it's not a gigantic selling point of the set of like the basic lands have flavor text, and there's a lot of cards that kind of present you with choices of like what you would do if you came to a river or saw something on watch or something like that. But they're just cool, and they reflect what the experience of D&D is or can be, or like the collective storytelling that we're all engaging in. And so that's really what the set is full of, and why I really like it.
I like that too.
It's cool that the idea of actually taking something from from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms and actually using it in your D&D game is very cool. I don't know if that was something that just is like a side effect of the cool stuff you were already doing, or if you went into it thinking about ways that you could actually pull Adventures in the Forgotten Realm into D&D tabletop. Was that a design tenet?
It's mostly a side effect. But I mean, the core design intent behind having the flavor text there was to make the basic lands inspiring. What I was going to say earlier is, basic lands are the most basic building block of any Magic set. They usually don't warrant a lot of thought, but it's really cool to me how we're able to communicate so much about the world and the game of D&D on these. I don't want to say throwaway cards, but that's the only word coming to my mind. these very, very basic lands,
And you've been doing that a lot, James, with your work in the Plane Shift articles, as well as things of taking things that are, small flavor text throughout all of the sets over the last few years, and then grabbing that and turning it into something that D&D players could then play with. And in many ways, your work has been the foundation upon which, Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica coming out, Theros, and even the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms coming together. So, I think we have you to thank for mixing this chocolate and peanut butter together.
Thank you, James.
Okay, I'll take that. You're welcome.
Because you've been at Wizards long enough where there was we can never put chocolate and peanut butter together. They should not be together.
I remember that.
And I think you very quickly just were like, here's why that's not true. I'm going to challenge that axiom.
I didn't do very much to challenge it. It's funny. So I mean, one of the funny things I remember when I first started working at Wizards in 2000. I remember some discussion about doing a D&D monster book of Magic monsters, and that was killed at the brand level at some point early on. And from that point, I remember the very clear doctrinal stance of we don't cross the streams, we don't mix the brands. But the other part of the story that I tell is when I did Plane Shift Zendikar, I got a brand manager on my side, and we walked around the fourth floor, and we couldn't find anybody to say no. Like that institutional knowledge had faded away,
had left the building.
The stance had softened. So it's not like I had to fight for it, really. I looked, and I couldn't find anybody to tell me not to do it, so we did it. But it's super fun for me. I spent 6 years on the Magic team as a little detour in my career. And I started off that time working on the Zendikar art book and the Plane Shift Zendikar supplement that when it came out with it, and then ended that time with Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. So I feel like I came full circle. I did what I set out to do in a way that I had no intention of doing at all. And it's good to be back on the D&D team now.
It's good to have you back.
It's exciting. And I think in some ways that institutional knowledge spread out into the fandom too, like where I think fandoms were just like, oh, that's just not what they're going to do ever. And so when you started doing those things, it was this, I remember this news cycle just being like, oh, is this something that's going to be something to experiment with, and what's going to end up? And I think Adventures of the Forgotten Realms is, I wouldn't say necessarily a culmination, but it does feel like the crossing the Rubicon moment where D&D is firmly in the Magic multiverse and vice versa. And I think that's really awesome. And I think there is only more to come along those lines. And, let me ask this question of you, Max. Like, how could you see things, I'm not asking you product stuff in the future, but just like, what are some things that you could see now being open to both designers on both teams?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we can do, right? In a lot of ways, not doing D&D and Magic together for such a long time, I think sort of set the fan expectation of, well, if they were going to do that, surely they would have done it by now. And it's the main thing about it is it really is just cool to be able to bring elements of great games together in ways that make sense for both games, right? Like Magic is a game about magic and discovering new planes and new worlds and new characters. And there's just a lot of natural, like that's just very much also what Dungeons and Dragons is about. And so it's as part of kind of filling up all the whiteboards in the building, there's a lot that we know we can do now, and there's a lot of space we know we didn't mine with Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. And based on kind of the reactions we're seeing, it sounds like that's the kind of thing that people are excited to see more of. And we're excited to make things that people are excited to see more of, right? It's not to say that like the nature of the cosmology is kind of fuzzy, right? The short version is that we made the Planeswalker card, but she's not going to feature in Magic fiction. Magic Planeswalkers aren't going to like randomly show up in the next D&D adventure module. But we can tell stories with those characters on Magic cards in ways that are cool and true to the spirit of those characters. And it's really easy to take the worlds that Magic builds and make D&D source books out of them. Like the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica is super cool, right? Ravnica is this a different plane in Magic that's just one gigantic city, and that's a fantasy trope that's actually not super widely explored. And so it's really fun for the D&D team to be able to play with that. And like there's all these different factions, and there's a lot of intrigue, and there's a lot you can do to build a campaign in a setting like that. And so we're just kind of always looking for more ways to do cool things. And so that's what we're doing with Adventures in the Forgotten Realms and what we're kind of looking at for the future.
I like that a lot. It reminds me of, I want you to ask your question. So the chocolate and peanut butter metaphor I can't put down, because it sounds like you're like candy makers now, and you're like, oh man, how many other ways can we put chocolate and peanut butter and cookie crunch and caramel together?
Put some pretzel in there too.
Yeah, and pretzel to make a Take 5, to make a Kit Kat. Like I feel like there's so much more possibilities now, and I'm hungry. So go ahead, Shelley.
You never got your soup. So
I never got my soup.
Now we're gonna go talk about candy. You mentioned, Max, the fan reactions have been positive, but it just dig in a little bit more to that. What have you seen from the community? Hooray, let's do this.
Yeah, there's
what are they most excited about?
Yeah, I would say by and large, people are excited to see their favorite D&D characters on Magic cards. The overlap between the Dungeons and Dragons audience and the Magic audience is very large, and one of the things that's relatively unique to both games, is that they have a really long and rich history, right? It's unusual for a gaming property to have 20 years of history, and Magic and D&D both have more. And so, people read about Jordan when, they were a lot younger, and that one of the classic fantasy characters in their minds. And seeing him on a card is really exciting. Seeing Gwynhoevar, and all of his companions is something people are excited about. People are excited to see the magic gods. Sorry, the D&D gods on magic cards. Magic's put other gods on magic cards from its own cosmology, and people are excited. They want to see how it'll be different. They want to see how it'll be the same. They want to see what planeswalkers look like when they're D&D characters and not magic characters, and talk about what implications that might have for their own campaigns or their own storytelling.
That's super cool. During our 300th special episode, we spoiled 2 cards from this set, the Flumph and Tasha's Hideous Laughter. And I want to kind of talk about those a little bit, since, some of this audience might have seen those and want to ask questions. And they're a good representation of like monsters and spells that got translated into this set. So the Flumph is interesting to me because they're a good aligned monster from the Underdark. They usually can be used as one of the sole bright spot in these underground caverns. And they're a white creature here. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I see you smiling, James. Did you, have anything to say about the Flumph and how it was like translating something like that to a magic card?
I'm actually laughing about Tasha's laughter.
That one's good too.
Because when I was concepting the set, writing the art descriptions, I got to that card and I went and I asked my daughter, who's 24, I said, what's the funniest creature you can imagine casting Tasha's Hideous Laughter on? And she said a Behir, so that's where we ended up.
Oh, nice.
But the Flumph, the amusing thing I remember about that is getting the first sketch back. So here's actually an interesting thing about concepting the art for this set. Is most of the time when we do art for monsters in D&D, we're trying to really show you what the monster looks like in a sort of illustrative way, like almost like a scientific illustration, so you can clearly see what the characters are going to be encountering. And when you're commissioning art for a magic set, what you're looking for is something that evokes what it feels like in its environment and what it's like when you encounter it. So like, I was super excited to commission art of a displacer beast where we can actually see it displacing, because we're not just showing you displacer beast in the abstract figure 1.3. We're showing you displacer beast in the environment, and it's weird and distorted. So the Flumph was like that too. We actually showed it using its reactive attack, which is spraying a cloud of noxious acid or something. Sometimes you don't realize when you're writing those art descriptions what it's going to look like when an artist renders it. And it came back looking really bad until we turned the Flumph around so you couldn't actually see it ejecting the spray. That's all I will say about that.
Yeah.
My imagination will fill in the gaps.
Yes.
Nice.
Oh,
what were you going to say, Max?
Oh, I was going to say perhaps best left to the imagination. So there's a Flumph on my desk right now, and I was looking at it while James was talking, and then I started to see how the piece could be reimagined in a different way, and so forth. But yeah, I mean the Flumph is cool. It's one of the very few creatures that I was not familiar with from D&D, and so, but it's the kind of thing where it's like you see it in the file and they're like, what is that? And they're like, oh, it's an Underdark jellyfish. What? Tell me more, right? And that's cool too. Like you're getting to deepen your connection with both games in a weird way that I would never have expected to learn about a new Dungeons and Dragons monster while working on a Magic card set.
Yeah, and that's hopefully what, Magic fans will get when they see that, and they'll be like, what is that? I want to learn more. And they're like, well, there's a lot to learn about Flumphs. They're fun. But I like also that they are helpful in their mechanics, right? I think the things that it makes every player draw a card, which feels very...
Yeah, whenever it's dealt damage, you and target opponent, not necessarily the opponent who damaged it, each draw a card.
Ah, target opponent from... Yeah, so I like that too. Like that's really interesting.
Yeah, you can get kind of like political with, all right, so this person's attacking me, so let's you and me draw a card. Like Greg and I will draw a card and we'll go get Shelly, right?
No,
We're having the temerity to attack me. How dare you?
no, you won't.
No cards for you.
No,
Right?
do not accept.
But even that, the way you just mentioned political, I didn't consider that, but that is such a big part of what the Flumps are, right? They're about like trying to make peace where they can within the Underdark, and can oftentimes help adventurers in that way. And they don't want to be known, they don't want to be seen, and so they might give you information just so that the group of mind flayers down the road doesn't know that they're there, and that type of thing. And I think that's again a mechanic that is very simple, but accomplishes the feeling of a flump very well. And the same thing for Tasha's Hideous Laughter. The mechanic there, do you have that called up by any chance?
I don't have that card on my deck.
I believe that one was you have to draw, your target player mills up to 20 mana cost.
You mill cards until you've milled 20 mana value worth of cards.
Which is a very original. I don't think I've ever seen that number. 20 feels like a lot.
Yeah. And I mean, if your deck is all lands, it just mills them all because lands don't have a mana value. So it's a variable but large number in a way that's exciting. Like every time they pull the next card off, it's like, ooh, let's keep going. And that's super fun, and it's shockingly powerful in formats where you don't have 60 cards in your deck. So like the Magic Draft formats, for example, you could pretty easily mill 20 cards with Tasha's Hideous Laughter, which is not a lot of cards left in your deck at that point. When you run out of cards, you lose. So it's exciting, and it's fun to resolve every time.
Yeah. And I like that it's got a bit of chaos to it too, right? Where you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's, just know it's going to be bad, and it might even be funny. Right, and that's
should result in some.
You might even laugh.
Well, yes, I will definitely be hideously laughing whenever I play that card.
Cackling is required.
Luckily, cackling.
Well, you got to
is a
have
free
that
action
role play.
in D&D.
So there you go. So something that is inherent to D&D, and maybe not so much in Magic, but is the collaboration, working together. D&D, we come together and we accomplish a goal as a party. In Magic, it's been a while, like I said, since I've played Magic, but I remember people just really trying to kill me and take me down. Was there any way to like bring in that collaborative feeling? Is that just not even important? We've got D&D for that. Just curious if you thought of ways of doing that. Nope. We're not doing it.
No,
you got to call out who you're going to ask. I think they're waiting.
I know. I was like looking to see if somebody seemed like they were more excited about that question than the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's kind of a lot of levels to that, right? The first, I think, is, historically, I think both Magic and to a lesser extent D&D were not terribly accessible to newer players. Like if you weren't somebody who was already deeply steeped in being a nerd about whichever game, and you showed up to your local game store and you were like, hey, I'm kind of interested and want to play, that was something that, the folks who were already there were kind of like, yeah, get out of here. And in both Magic and D&D, that we've come a long way, right? Like both communities are now much more welcoming than they've ever been, because everyone realized, we just want more people to play with. And Magic has actually embraced this, I think, the most. Like for a very long time, a big part of Magic's kind of organized play system was, okay, we're going to get everybody together and we're going to hold a bunch of tournaments and we're going to find out who the best Magic player is. And that's not how everybody wants to consume their card games. Some people just want to play and have fun and see what can happen. And so we've got the Commander format for that. And Adventures in the Forgotten Realms does have Commander decks built with Adventures in the Forgotten Realms cards that are releasing with this set. that you can play with, and they're all themed around various things. And in those games, like, you can do different ways to be a party. The games typically aren't fully cooperative, but in Commander, like, everyone kind of implicitly understands that it's not very important who wins. It matters, like, what stories you can tell about the game afterwards. And it's a lot easier to jump into a Commander game than it is to jump into a Magic tournament with people you don't know. Like, you just show up to Greg's house and be like, "Hey, it's Commander night. I brought soda and pretzels," and go.
For folks who, I imagine there's going to be people who are listening to this who aren't familiar with that format, or maybe even haven't played Magic in years. So I know it's a relatively newer format. So what is Commander for the lay people, Dungeons and Dragons listeners?
Yeah, so the I should start with the base version of the Magic card game is you and your opponent play, and
I think more about the Commander. How does Commander work?
Right. So in Commander, you can play with any number of people. Most often 4 or 5 are the best numbers, and you build a Commander deck, which is different from a Magic deck in a few ways. The first is that you have a Commander, and your Commander is the card that you kind of build the rest of your deck around. So, for example, if Tiamat was your Commander in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, Tiamat, it says put a bunch of dragons in your deck, and then when you cast Tiamat, you can go get a bunch of dragons and put them into your hand. So when you're building your Tiamat Commander deck, you build it differently than you might build your Drizzt Do'Urden Commander deck. Drizzt Do'Urden is all about making Drizzt, like, cards that would make him larger and more powerful and more more awesome, and buffing up Drizzt. And the kind of Magic deck you build with that is different from the kind of Magic deck you build when Tiamat is your Commander. Your Commander is always your favorite legendary creature. And so players start with more life. You can only use one of each card, so like you can't build your deck to do the same thing every time. So all of the games are a lot more different from each other. There's the decks are bigger. There are 100 cards instead of 60. And so the games there's a little more time to develop. They're never the same each time, and it's become a very popular way to sort of play with your friends and get everybody together, as opposed to breaking out into a bunch of one-on-one games.
There's a sort of a sense of identity, that like a connection that you form with your commander in the same way that you do your D&D character. This is my commander deck. I identify with this in a personal way.
And that feels very D&D, right? That feels very much like
that does.
The experience people have when building their first character, except they're just building this deck and this army. If you want to bring that metaphor into it, to play against each other. But this is the first time I've heard that it's not necessarily about winning, right? Like, how does that work and play out? Like, is there teams? Can you do it that way?
You could. I mean, you can kind of do it however you and your friends want, and like you could try it. Like, typically games are a free for all, but you could try, hey, let's do, you and me, like you, Greg, you and I against Shelly and James, and like we could see if that's fun. And if it is, maybe we'll play again, or maybe we'll change the teams for next time, or maybe we'll go back to a free for all. The thing about where it's not sort of all about winning, like somebody does win in the end, but I would, at least the people with whom I play Commander the most, like it's more impressive to us if you do something epic and awesome in order to win, as opposed to like, oh, I got this like Goldblur combo going and one shot the entire table out of nowhere. Like we all know that can be done, and it's not very interesting. And so it's kind of like caught on throughout a lot of the format. Sheldon Menery, who's one of the folks who invented the Commander format, actually, like when he's playing with his friends, if somebody assembles some infinite combo, they're just like, okay, you won, that's nice. The rest of us are going to finish the game now. And then typically people don't infinite combo him very often. And it's just kind of more fun. Like, it's not the kind of format where it's fun to maximize how to win, kind of like D&D itself, right? Like you can build the most hyper optimized character that's very good at doing some specific thing. Like I played a lot of 3rd edition where the 10-foot spiked chain was just like very good because of some quirk of the attack of opportunity rules. And like typically your DM got tired of that and was like, okay, that doesn't work that way anymore. You can change your character if you want, but I've had enough of this. And that's kind of how a lot of Commander players are. Right, yeah. And so there's a lot of emphasis these days, on, especially in Commander, on, you know, let's make sure the game's fun for everybody. Let's not just try to all be the most competitive all the time, because, you know, if you want that, you can go play a tournament. That's not what the Commander is there for. That's great. And James, let me ask you this. Do you think that the Commander format would be more palatable to a D&D fan for a first round if they wanted to try out Magic, or like, oh, let me try this Adventures in the Forgotten Realms? Would Commander be something they would be interested in?
I think so, for sure. I mean, partly because you can just go and buy a pre-constructed Commander deck, and the Commander decks for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, the face cards of the four decks are concepted as members of an adventuring party. Who get into a fight over distributing treasure or something, but each one also has a face monster in it, so you might decide to make that your commander instead. But so yeah, you can go and buy a deck and sit down and play right away. When I left the D&D team and went and joined the Magic team, the creative team, world building folks on the Magic side, played Commander every week, and so that's really how I got deeply immersed into Magic when I started working on it. So I think it is a format that's pretty friendly to D&D players,
and almost pretty friendly to new players in general, just because you kind of, it's almost like a
Yes, with a caveat that sometimes the games can be pretty complicated, because you're making a deck of 100 cards. You're working with potentially cards from the whole history of Magic, and sometimes, like if you're not playing with a pre-constructed deck, somebody can bring cards to the table that just blow your mind and don't do what's printed on the card because the rules have been updated 6 times. It can be a little overwhelming, but usually in a good way.
Yeah, and the thing that's great about Commander too is that, like, you, by far the easiest way to learn Magic is by playing with someone. Because sort of like D&D, like the rules kind of have this holistic system, and trying to understand every part in turn is just really tough. And so it's like you really just want to start playing a couple of games to see what's going on. And if you're playing one of the one-on-one formats, like the person you're learning from is also your opponent, so it's kind of awkward, right? Like you have this hand of cards that you know you're supposed to keep hidden, but you don't know how they work, and so you have to ask your opponent, and then it's just awkward. But in Commander, you know, you can ask one of your opponents, and they'll be like, okay, here's how that works, and like maybe you should do this to that other thing, and like typically, you know, they'll be like, hey, here's how you could go wreck that other person, but that's fine, right? And they'll everybody will kind of understands that you're new, and they'll sort of be like, okay, here's how this card works. And even if it's weird and quirky, they'll be like, your intuition is probably that this works this way, but actually it works the other way, and it's fine. And typically, like, you know, your friends typically won't just turn around and gang up on you because you're the new person. More often than not, they'll leave you alone for a while. That's good too. And you can just kind of develop, and you can also see what's going on and see other people take their turns before you have to do anything.
Yeah. Okay. I want to go back to the whiteboards again, because I'm really wishing I saw these whiteboards. But this is a question for both of you. James, you can go first. Was there anything that made it into the game before you actually started playtesting and developing it that you were like, no way, that's never going to work, and you were surprised that it did? And then conversely, anything that you thought would absolutely be an easy to slot into Magic, and it actually did not?
I don't know.
Okay. Any surprises though that you were like, gosh, that really does work well in this game, or not, or maybe again something that you thought would have worked but couldn't translate over? Or we'll save it for the next Magic D&D set.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's not a lot that didn't work
That's surprising.
Tried. The main thing for the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms set is we had just finished Zendikar Rising when we were really getting into the swing of Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Zendikar Rising actually has a mechanic around being a party of adventurers, where if you have a fighter, a warrior and rogue cleric and wizard, that's good for you. And we were like, oh, we can port that into Adventures in the Forgotten Realms very easily. And it turned out that no, we couldn't, because we had just done it and it was very challenging to do again so quickly in a way that felt fresh. And so that the nature of the adventuring parties had to be more organic, of like, your adventuring party is whatever creatures you happen to have in play at the time, not cards that say, look at the characters in your party right now.
And the thing is, in Zendikar Rising,
go on.
Sorry, in Zendikar Rising, a whole lot of creatures had to be members of those 4 classes. And we had other classes we wanted to represent and a whole bunch of monsters we had to get into the set. And the party mechanic, as it was expressed in Zendikar Rising, just wouldn't have worked in this context.
Right, because you couldn't make a flump for
you gotta have him call a wizard a sorcerer in a way that satisfies nobody.
Except me. I'm okay with that. But I get it. You didn't make the set for me. But yeah, there's a lot in here. Oh, go on.
Another thing that I keep thinking about, and I haven't brought it up because I can't remember how it resolved, but I remember a conversation sitting around talking about making a card called 50 Feet of Rope, because that's so iconic. I'm pretty sure we did end up with a card called 50 Feet of Rope. But like, I went and looked at translations of the player's handbook to see, is that going to be 15 meters of rope? Does that have the same kind of resonance? I don't know how the card has been translated, but we did make the card.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I never thought about what the implication of that would be for other languages.
I ended up on a whole deep dive into how height and weight tables are translated in different languages. That sent me down a rabbit hole for an afternoon.
And then you're like, the metric system should be in D&D.
You never know where game design will lead you in an afternoon.
That's true.
I'm sure.
So what's been the most exciting aspect, whether it's a specific card or something that you're like, man, similar to Shelley's question, we're like, I'm so glad we were able to get this in a way that felt satisfying. And Max, I'll throw that to you first, as far as what's something that, you're happy about, and we'll worry about, previews and all that stuff later. But
yeah, I just love all the dragons, actually. I was really fascinated with all of the different types of dragons in D&D when I was a kid, because it made them seem even larger than life. And so in the Adventures of the Forgotten, like, it's not those dragons if you don't have a bunch of dragons, and so we do. And so we got to make the red, white, blue, green, and black dragons. We've got a bunch of legendary dragons, most of whom you're familiar with from other D&D books or campaign settings or whatever. And then we've got a couple extra dragons that are just cool. And then all of those dragons have super cool borderless versions that look totally awesome. And I've been opening a bunch of packs recently to check that everything got printed correctly. And every time I open one of those, I'm like, this is just completely awesome. I'm completely thrilled that we were able to make those kinds of cards. It just makes the teenage me very happy.
The teenage you, I imagine, playing D&D and Magic, had no idea that this could be a job one day.
Right. Yeah. That's true, actually.
So cool. And it's cool that you're opening the packs and you're getting excited as a fan, which maybe is like a benefit to working on something so many years ago. You forget. I forgot we did that. It's fresh and new.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, I never, ever imagined when I was a teenager that one day my job would be opening Magic packs, and it would be pretty boring because you have to painstakingly catalog everything you open to make sure that it's correct.
That takes the
every time
fun out of it.
you pull up in these cards, it's like, oh right, there's this. It's awesome. And then it's exciting. You're just like a kid again.
That's awesome.
So my feeling like a kid again thing with this set is the Booster Fun cards. Tom Jenkott, who was the art director for the Booster Fun, managed to get in touch with some really old school D&D artists to do a couple of pieces on these cards, and I'm stunned. I'm completely in awe, and I can't wait until we get to show those things off and reveal some of those names. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah,
I've seen those as well and been like, oh my gosh, you've got that person and that person. I remember those. It's great. Yeah, that is going to be a super fun thing for folks who have been playing D&D since first edition.
What a cool idea.
Yeah, there's 50 cards that are done that have special alternate art versions that are done in the style of the old monster manuals and kind of like the line drawings. And they look incredible. They're really
the
really
Beholder.
Cool. And in some cases illustrated by the same people.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah,
that is amazing.
Yeah.
Lots of history to draw from there. And James, you mentioned the art a couple of times, and I think that's something that we could really delve into here, because I think there's something interesting about what you said about like how D&D art in some ways is supposed to illustrate not necessarily a feeling, but here's where you're going to have to describe something in a scientific way. And with magic, it's more about the action. I almost feel like trying to get those. It's kind of those bigger illos that show up in D&D books that kind of show the feel of what the game or the adventure is trying to convey. But then you had to create 260 of those. And was there ones that any specific artist or things or art direction that you wanted to call out to get people excited about popping these open, just like Max is excited about popping them open?
I will just shout out Zach Stella as the art director for the main set. He did a fantastic job and got amazing work from our artists. But I mean, like, my favorite part of working on the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica and Mythic Odysseys of Theros was we had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars of art to choose from to put into these books. And to be able to commission new pieces of the D&D art that I dream of. There's also a lot of, I guess not as much as I remember, but like I was working with the old core rule books next to me and threw in a number of homages to classic D&D art. Let me just say there's a Sphere of Annihilation illustration that is strongly reminiscent of an illustration in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide.
That's awesome.
I was like, do this, but modern. Exciting.
Do artists appreciate line readings like that? Are they like, or are they like actors who are like, you can't tell me how to do my job?
Finding the right degree of direction is important in concepting art.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That could be a whole podcast in itself, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
The art commissioning process.
We have heard that from from D&D lead art designers as well too, where like that art description, it's only 5 or 6 sentences at most, but you got to convey what the composition is, and that's a special skill that I don't think a lot of people think about when they think about like, hey, I want to get into writing D&D books or making magic cards.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Sweet. Well, we're excited about this, and hopefully one day there'll be a Adventures in the Forgotten Realms source book from D&D, so you can kind of play in this D&D world.
We're just going to keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
Are you writing up the plane shift for this one, James?
Nope. But I can offer you the Sword Coast Adventures Guide.
There it is. It's got so much fun stuff in it too. Awesome. Well, I can't wait. July 22nd is when folks will be able to get the physical cards for this, and they'll be in Magic Arena as well for folks who have been loving playing that on their phones or on their PCs in various ways. Super accessible in that way. And I hope even just by us talking about Commander, that more D&D fans might want to get into that format and check out some of these fun things, as not a substitute, but just as an additional activity that your D&D or board gaming group can do on a weekly basis.
Yeah, Magic was actually originally invented to play while you're waiting for your D&D group to show up or your thing to fire at Origins.
That chocolate was just sitting next to that peanut butter for 25, 30 years before James Wyatt finally decided to mix it in there.
Before I tripped and got my chocolate in somebody's jar of peanut butter.
That's how the best games are made.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just glad that there was no one on the fourth floor when you were asking people so that they couldn't.
I know. He's probably like walking around to like finance, HR, he didn't really ask any of the business people. Hey, do you like these two things together? What do you think? Who could say no to James Wyatt to his face anyway?
Sure. That's my secret superpower.
All right, well, thanks both of you for your work on this.
Yes.
Bring back the thanks to all the teams for putting this together. It's a culmination of a lot for Wizards of the Coast, and we're really happy about it. And I think you might have rolled a 12, so pretty good.
That's not bad.
All right.
Why don't I have dice next to me? What is wrong with me?
I don't know, James.
Now that you're back on the D&D team, you got to have a D20 ready to go.
Put those spin downs away and pull out those D20s. They are not the same thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Very excited.